There is a photograph I keep coming back to. It shows a building so impossibly long that both ends vanish into the mountain mist, 650 feet of iron and glass and Beaux-Arts stone, rising from a carved plateau in the Pyrenees as if it had always been there, as if the mountain itself had grown it. 365 windows, 156 doors, a grand hall with chandeliers and marble floors, a hotel, a customs house, a hospital. All of it built for trains that would never arrive in the numbers anyone imagined. The building is Canfranc International Railway Station. It sits at over 4,000 feet above sea level on the Spanish side of the French border, surrounded by snow and silence. And in 1970, they simply walked away from it. One bridge collapsed, one derailment, one moment of bureaucratic indifference. And just like that, one of the most ambitious border crossing stations ever built in European history became a ghost. But here is the question that keeps me awake. Was it really just bad luck? Or was Canfranc always destined to be sealed away? Because when I started pulling at the threads of this story and the stories of the other great railway megaprojects that vanished across Europe, I found something that unsettled me deeply. These were not small dreams. These were visions of a continent remade, networks of iron stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals, tunnels bored through the bones of mountains, trains the size of ocean liners gliding at 200 miles per hour through a unified empire of steel. They built the blueprints, they surveyed the routes, they hired the engineers. Some of them even broke ground, and then they disappeared. Every single one. I want to take you back to 1880, not 1980, 1880, because most people alive today do not know that the Channel Tunnel was not invented in our lifetime. The machine was already in the ground over a century before the tunnel that exists today was even proposed. His name was Sir Edward Watkin, and he was perhaps the most ambitious railwayman Britain ever produced. He controlled railways across England, Scotland, and Wales. He was a member of Parliament, and in the summer of 1880, he descended 163 feet below the cliffs of Dover in a metal skip and began boring a tunnel beneath the English Channel. A compressed air boring machine, 33 feet long, cutting through chalk at half a mile per month, was already turning in the dark beneath the sea. On the French side at Sangatte, a mirror image machine began from the other direction. By the spring of 1883, the British bore had reached over a mile in length. The French had matched it. Both crews were working toward each other through the same layer of gray chalk marl the geologists had confirmed ran unbroken from one shore to the other. They were going to do it. They were genuinely going to connect Britain to the continent by rail in the 19th century. And then it stopped. Not because of a technical problem. The rock was fine, the machines were working, the engineering was sound. It stopped because of fear. A military commission was convened. General Sir Garnet Wolseley, the most decorated British officer of his age, declared that a tunnel would be a permanent open wound in England's defenses, that any foreign army could use it to pour men and weapons onto British soil. The newspapers erupted. Cartoons showed French soldiers charging through the tunnel with bayonets. Even Queen Victoria, who had previously supported the idea, turned against it. The government ordered the work to stop. The shafts were backfilled. The boring machines were sealed underground. The investors lost everything. And so the question I find myself asking is this. In 1880, who truly feared that tunnel? The public? Ordinary people who had never seen a geopolitical map in their lives? Or was there something more calculated at work? A deliberate decision by those who controlled the flow of trade and movement between nations, who understood perfectly well that a rail connection to the continent would alter the balance of European power in ways they could not fully control. The tunnel they abandoned in 1882 was not discovered until 1988. When workers boring the modern Channel Tunnel broke through into the old Victorian heading. It had been sitting there in the dark for over a century, waiting. Now I want to tell you about a dream so enormous, so staggering in its ambition, that when I first encountered it, I genuinely could not believe it had been erased so completely from public memory. It is called the Breitspurbahn, and if the name means nothing to you, that tells you everything. The Breitspurbahn, the broad gauge railway, was a proposed rail network conceived during the Second World War, and I want to be precise about what it actually was, because the scale of it is almost incomprehensible. Standard European railway tracks are 4 feet 8.5 inches wide. The Breitspurbahn was to be built on tracks 9 feet 10 inches wide, more than double, a gauge so vast that the rolling stock designed for it would have been closer to architecture than transportation. The carriages were to be 7 meters tall, 6 meters wide, double-decked, 42 meters long. Each train would carry between 2,000 and 4,000 passengers traveling at 200 kilometers per hour. Inside those trains, restaurants, lounges, a swimming pool, a barber, a sauna, a theater. The comparison made at the time was not to other trains, but to the great ocean liners, the Mauretania, the Normandy, the floating palaces of the North Atlantic. Except these were not ships, they were to travel on land. From Hamburg to Berlin, Berlin to Munich, Munich to Vienna, and then further, to Istanbul, to the mineral fields of Ukraine, to the industrial heart of Silesia. Early planning documents, and these are real documents, found in German railway archives decades later by a historian named Anton Joachimsthaler. These documents show routes being sketched all the way to Vladivostok, to the Strait of Gibraltar, across a Bering Land bridge to North America. 100 officials and 80 engineers continued working on the project throughout the war. The company Luftschiffbau Zeppelin, the Zeppelin Company, became involved, contributing aerodynamic expertise for carriages that would move like nothing the world had ever seen. Krupp, Henschel, Borsig, Brown Boveri, every major industrial titan of Central Europe was at the table. The stations designed for this railway were not stations as we understand them. They were cathedrals. The Berlin Südbahnhof was to be larger than New York's Grand Central Terminal, encased in glass. Every major city was to receive a new terminal, built to the scale of the empire it was meant to serve. And then the war ended, and the Breitspurbahn simply ceased to exist. The plans were folded away into archive boxes. The models, there are physical scale models of these carriages still preserved today at the DB Museum in Nuremberg, were stored in silence. The engineers dispersed. The dream evaporated. But here's what I cannot stop thinking about. The engineering concepts in those plans, the ballastless concrete track bed, the low-gradient dedicated corridor, the aerodynamic carriage profiles, those same concepts appeared in the designs of the French TGV 30 years later, in the Shinkansen, in the high-speed rail networks that now cross Europe. The ideas did not disappear. They migrated. They surfaced in other forms, under other names, attributed to other hands. Where did the knowledge go? Who carried it forward? And who decided that this particular network, this particular vision of a continent bound together by iron, had to be buried? Now to the Spanish Pyrenees, to that impossible building I described at the beginning, Canfranc. Planning for the station began in the 19th century. The problem was simple on the surface and extraordinary in its complexity. France and Spain used different rail gauges. French tracks were standard European gauge. Spanish tracks were broader. To travel from Paris to Madrid by rail, you could not simply pass through the mountains. You had to stop, unload every passenger and every piece of cargo, and physically transfer it from one set of trains to another. Canfranc was to be the solution, a grand international exchange station, half French, half Spanish, sitting astride the border like a palace. 15 years of weather observation went into choosing the site. The Somport Tunnel was bored through the mountain, 7,875 meters of rock, and completed in 1915 despite the First World War. Dozens of bridges were constructed across the ravines and gorges of the Pyrenean foothills. And then the station itself rose from an artificial plateau carved from the mountainside, 240 meters long, the second largest station building in all of Europe at the time of its opening. The Spanish king came, the French president came. In 1928, Canfranc opened with all the ceremony its builders believed it deserved. And almost immediately, it began to die. 50 passengers a day, that was the average. The incompatible gauges meant that every journey through Canfranc required a laborious transfer. Every suitcase lifted by crane from one train to another. Every customs form completed twice. The Wall Street crash of 1929 arrived the year after it opened. A fire damaged the lobby in 1931. The Spanish Civil War closed the tunnel entirely from 1936 to 1939. But here is where the story of Canfranc becomes something far stranger than a simple tale of failed infrastructure. During the Second World War, this station, this dying, half-empty station in the mountains, became one of the most important crossing points in occupied Europe. In the early years of the war, thousands of Jews fleeing occupied France passed through Canfranc on their way to Lisbon, to boats, to safety. A French customs officer at the station was secretly helping them, falsifying documents, hiding people, passing intelligence to Allied embassies in Madrid. And at the same time, from the other direction, Nazi gold was moving through those same platforms. Documented gold, over 86 tons of it confirmed in the archives, with researchers suggesting the true figure exceeded 100 tons, plundered from Jewish victims and murdered populations across occupied Europe, loaded on freight trains, passed through Canfranc, and sent into neutral Portugal and Spain to finance the Reich's war machine. The same station, the same platforms, refugees in one direction, stolen gold in the other. A swastika flew above the Art Nouveau facades, and after the war ended, Nazi war criminals used those same tracks to vanish into South America. In 1970, a freight train derailed on the French side and destroyed a bridge that historians later noted could have been repaired without extraordinary difficulty. France chose not to repair it. The international section of the line was closed. The station was abandoned. 52 years it sat empty in the mountains. The racks rusted, the roof collapsed, the chandeliers grew moss, wolves were reported in the platforms. And beneath it, in the tunnels carved from the living rock, Spanish physicists quietly established one of the world's leading dark matter research laboratories. They chose it, they said, for its depth, its isolation, its unique geological properties. I have no reason to doubt them, and yet I cannot help but notice that Canfranc International Railway Station, the building that saw the transit of occupied Europe's gold, the passage of its refugees, the movement of its war criminals, now sits directly above a facility studying some of the most fundamental and least understood forces in the known universe. Whether that's coincidence or poetry, I cannot say. There is another project I want you to know about, one that almost no one speaks of today, though it would have connected two of the oldest nations in Europe by rail for the first time in history. In 1890, a British engineer named Luke Livingston Macassey completed a detailed plan for a railway tunnel beneath the North Channel, the narrow strait of water between Scotland and Ireland. The tunnel was to run for approximately 30 miles, linking the Scottish town of Stranraer to the city of Belfast. Macassey had studied the geology, he had reviewed 4 different tunnel configurations, he had dismissed bridges and causeways as impractical, and concluded that a bored tunnel through the seafloor was both feasible and necessary. This was the same man who would later design the water system that brought clean water from the mountains of Mourne to Belfast, saving the city from cholera. He was not a dreamer, he was an engineer of the first rank. The tunnel was never funded, never built. The plans were folded away and the idea was not seriously revisited for another century. And yet today, there are people in both countries who believe that this connection, this 30-mile tunnel beneath the Irish Sea, is as inevitable as the Channel Tunnel eventually proved to be. The same arguments made against it in 1890 are still being made today. The cost, the geology, the politics. But I find myself asking the same question I always ask when I encounter these vanished megaprojects. Who benefits from the absence of this connection? Who profits from the continued separation of places that engineers 130 years ago had already decided could be joined? The knowledge was there. The will was there. Something else was not. I have spent a long time now following these vanished railways across the map of Europe, and I want to share something I've come to believe. These projects were not abandoned because they were impossible. The technology existed or was being developed. The surveyors had done their work. The routes had been chosen. In almost every case, the ground had actually been broken. They were abandoned because someone decided they should be. Not always maliciously, not always with a grand design in mind. Sometimes it was fear, as in the Channel Tunnel of 1882, where military paranoia and the fevers of nationalism were enough to silence 3 miles of finished tunnel. Sometimes it was the chaos of war, as with the Bright Spoorbahn, whose plans survived into the post-war era in a filing cabinet until a historian found them in the 1980s and the world briefly remembered they existed. Sometimes it was bureaucratic indifference dressed up as a minor operational decision, as with Canfranc, where a bridge was allowed to remain unrepaired until the excuse to close the line became permanent. But the pattern that emerges when you look at all of them together is this. Every time Europe was about to be bound more tightly together by rail, every time a network was about to be created that would have moved people and goods and ideas across the continent with a speed and freedom that had never existed before, something intervened. A war, a commission, an accident, a shift in political will. And the tunnels were sealed. The plans were filed away. The great stations slowly filled with weeds and silence. I want to leave you with one final image. When the engineers boring the modern Channel Tunnel broke through into the old Victorian heading in 1988, they found something unexpected. The tunnel that Sir Edward Watkin had begun in 1880, that had been shut down, backfilled, officially erased from existence for over a century, was still there. The chalk walls were intact, the geometry was sound, and the direction of the bore was almost perfectly aligned with the modern tunnel being constructed around it. A man in 1880 had pointed his machine in exactly the right direction. He had gotten the geology right, the angle right, the method right. He had simply been stopped. 106 years later, engineers following the same path broke through his wall and found his work waiting for them in the dark. I think about that moment often. The way the past does not disappear. The way it simply waits, sealed in chalk and silence for someone with enough patience or enough determination to break through. These railways were not lost. They were hidden. And the question I find myself returning to every time I trace another route on another yellowed survey map is this. What else is waiting? What other connections between places, between people, between ideas were surveyed and planned and partly built and then quietly folded away by hands we will never see for reasons we have never been told? The archive does not lie. It only sleeps. And the tracks are still there, beneath the weeds and the moss and the decades of official silence, still pointing in the right direction.